Welcome to Retro Sports Rewind, a podcast where we look back at some of the greatest games in sports history. We rewatch these classics, give you the history behind the matchup, run through the highlights, and discuss what made each game so great. We invite you to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. And we also ask that you please rate and review the show. We love those 5-star ratings and appreciate everybody taking the time to share the show with their friends. We are also on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at RetroSportsPod, Instagram at RetroSportsRewind, and like us on Facebook at Facebook.com/RetroSportsRewind. I'm Zach Wilt, and I'm joined by my good pals. First up, it's Jabby Burns. How are you, Jab?
I'm doing great, Zach. I am so excited for today's show. Very relevant from what we got going on here, television-wise for me, because as you guys know, I don't watch any actual shows. Like, if you could tell me Ozark's great, it probably is. All the different shows that you guys watch. Now, I will watch a movie, and I'm excited to talk about a movie that you brought up, Zach, in the bullpen, that I think I need to rewatch, too. But I'm just excited. It's going to be a fun show today.
Yeah, I'm super pumped for this one, so let's welcome in Patrick Guthrie. How are you, Patrick?
I'm good, man. And besides this being super relevant, and it's partially why we picked it, I feel like this is a sweet spot in terms of years. Like, this area of the 90s is like, it's good to get two perspectives because, like, Jab, obviously this is like probably like peak betting for you, or one of your peak betting periods. So you can give us the perspective of like being an adult and betting on this game, which I'm sure you. I mean, there's betting on the NBA is a blast, and this is like, late childhood for me and Zach, who deified Michael Jordan. Like, and we both agreed on it. We were both talking before the show. Neither of us were Bulls fans. We both had Michael Jordan posters. We both had Michael Jordan jerseys. Like, I think this is a cool kind of time to talk about because we both have two very different perspectives on this game.
And very relevant as the whole world is watching The Last Dance right now with no live sports. And we just got the last two episodes of The Last Dance airing. I guess we should disclose we recorded this before those two have aired. But we've been watching just like everybody else and have really, really loved it. So it was fun to go back and rewatch this full broadcast. We'll talk about what we actually thought of the broadcast. But
was it though, Zach? 'Cause I know how you feel, but we'll talk about it later.
I'm going to say my feelings on the broadcast. I liked watching Michael do his thing. Last week we went back to 1980 for the Miracle on Ice. That was fun. That was a fun broadcast. We saw the U.S. upset the Soviet Union at the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. That was an amazing look back. One of the greatest upsets ever. One of the greatest sports calls ever. So we're excited to be back with you again. Looking forward to rewinding again. So, Jab, we've kind of spoiled it, but why don't you tell us exactly what's in store for this week?
Well, what's in store is Zach's going to be very angry at one point in the podcast, which I really look forward to. But this way, we're going to get back in the DeLorean, not have to go as far as we did to 1980. This is more 1998, and I think Patrick pointed it out great. It's a perfect wheelhouse for both of our times in our life when we were where we were and how we were. And yes, Patrick, there was plenty of wagering going on during this 1998 Game 6 NBA Finals between the Chicago Bulls and the Utah Jazz at the Delta Center, which, by the way, is one of the loudest arenas out there, and that's something that we'll get to in this here in Salt Lake City. Huge game, and one that is down for the history books for sure, Zach.
Yeah, and it's funny watching this and really feeling what the stakes were like, because that's what The Last Dance is all about. So when you finally get to this moment, it felt huge rewatching this game because we've watched 10 episodes of an hour-long documentary about the build-up to it. So I'm looking forward to talking about the game, but I feel like the setup for this matchup is really huge. So, Patrick, why don't you set us up and take us back to 1998?
Oh, my God. There's so much to get into for this particular game, this particular series as a whole. Obviously, if you've been watching The Last Dance at all, you probably have a great perspective on what was going on with the 1998 Bulls going into this series. But obviously, this is the last season of probably the greatest dynasty. I wouldn't even say probably the greatest dynasty in NBA history. I mean, 2 three-peats when Michael Jordan was a part of the team with the Chicago Bulls. And this was probably, I would say, the toughest opponent that they ever got was the Jazz. This was their second finals in a row against the Jazz. And the majority of the games, if you look across those 2 years, were really close games. These teams matched up well. I mean, there were times that the Bulls would play somebody in the finals, and like they blew out the Lakers early in the 90s. The Sonics kind of put up a fight back at the first win of their second three-peat, but it wasn't. I mean, nobody ever thought they were a threat to win that series. The Jazz had proved the year before in '97 that they were a threat to beat the Bulls. They lost that game. They lost that series in 6 games as well. They have 2 bona fide, phenomenal Hall of Famers on their team between Karl Malone and John Stockton. And the Jazz kind of actually had almost a little bit of an easier road to the finals than the Bulls did. They had swept the conference finals against the Lakers. Their only tough series was in the first round against the Rockets, which they won in 5 games, but they had also beaten the Spurs 4-1 in that series. So they had won 8 of 9 games coming into the finals. The Bulls had probably played their toughest series of their entire double three-peat run against the Pacers in the previous round and almost got knocked out in the 7th game in Chicago there. And this all set up throughout the series to be, a great game. And it went back and forth plenty of times. And there's so much to talk about going into in terms of, as we learned at the beginning of this broadcast, injuries. A lot of people weren't healthy for this game. John Stockton had a bad back. Scottie Pippen had a bad back. Howard Isley had vertigo. Like there's a lot kind of going on here that shows that you can see in the game as it goes as to why it's not the cleanest played game ever. Like there are moments where this game is really nice, specifically the second quarter where both teams kind of are hitting on all cylinders. But for a variety of reasons,
is a mess.
Yeah, there are messy, ugly parts of this game, which we can also talk about. Of like, this doesn't look like today's basketball. This isn't a team taking 30 threes a game. This is a team taking 10 threes a game. It is a rare opportunity to see a team take a three-pointer in this game. It doesn't happen often. The Jazz have a bunch of guys over 7 feet who can barely move, and that's kind of the way basketball was played in the 90s. We hear illegal defense calls, which is not something that even exists anymore. The Bulls get 4 illegal defense calls. But yeah, I mean, this is not only for the Bulls, because we've heard about it ad nauseum for good reason. Obviously, Jordan's the best player ever. This was supposed to be Jordan's last game. They're blowing up the team. Phil Jackson's going to leave. Scottie Pippen's going to sign somewhere else. The Jazz don't get talked about kind of in a similar way, in that this was an older Jazz team. This was, I think, Karl Malone was 34. John Stockton's 35. This was one of their last. Yeah, Hornacek's 34. This was one of their last shots at a championship as a really good team. That, I mean, there are so many good teams throughout the Jordan era that could have won if he wasn't there. But they put up a great fight throughout the entire series. All of these games were close except for one. And obviously this is in the Delta Center, like Jab said, one of the loudest places, one of the toughest places to play in the NBA, which you wouldn't think because, Utah. But they have some of the loudest, craziest fans, and this was a great game, at least to me. I mean, even though it was ugly, I really enjoyed watching it.
Yeah, I did too. I wanna before we get into the game, as I'm dying to do that, I do want to talk a little bit about the 98 Bulls, and The Last Dance is doing an amazing job recapping that. But we should remember we are a podcast that is pretty evergreen. So somebody may be listening to this years and years past when The Last Dance aired, and past the quarantine and all the craziness that we're living in now. I look forward to living in that future, hopefully sometime soon. 1998 was just a crazy year. Jab, we saw the relationship between Bulls GM Jerry Krause and Phil Jackson completely break apart, and this was Jackson his last year in Chicago, and Krause saying things like, you could go 82-0, you're not going to be the coach next year, and that relationship with the players deteriorating because of the things that he was saying. And we're watching Jordan travel to these different arenas, and tickets are selling out. He hasn't said he's retiring at the end of the year, but he's saying that he's not going to play for anybody but Phil Jackson. So that announcement doesn't come until after the season, but everybody's expecting that this is Jordan's last year. Of course, he comes back and plays with the Wizards a little bit after that, and this is his second retirement. We should point out. Even David Stern, Jordan was the All-Star Game MVP, and David Stern kind of makes a comment about, hopefully he'll come back next year and do it again, right? Like the NBA is so dependent on Michael Jordan as a star, and we see that in the TV ratings. And it's just a very crazy time in Chicago with this dynasty kind of coming to an end. And, there's uncertainty is not the right word, because I think we know what's coming, right? They do blow this team up at the end of the year, but none of that is really solidified until after this game.
No, and it's other things that it's interesting about this. As the season started for the 98 Bulls, you got to remember Scottie Pippen did not start that season. He had a foot injury. So they started off 9-7, by the way, record through November. Okay. So you got to remember that team. The team ended up going 62-20 overall. But I mean, 9-7 in November when Pippen comes back, they post that 13-game winning streak, and they go on and you see what happens. They beat the Nets, they beat the Hornets, and I think tell me if I'm wrong, Patrick, but the series against the Pacers to get to this finals might be the toughest series of Jordan's career. That team in Indiana, which later on ended up playing the Lakers in the finals a couple years later. Indiana was a thorn for the Bulls in that series, and it's very interesting. You point out how everybody's kind of beat up in that in the finals here in this finals against the Jazz. You would think the way that the Jazz coasted through those first three series, they would be okay, and that the Bulls would be the one that are down. But it turns out the Bulls are a little bit tougher and older, probably too.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. By the way, one of my least favorite teams ever, because it included probably my least favorite athlete ever, which is Reggie Miller, because he buried the Knicks a billion times.
Chris Mullin.
Chris Mullin, Mark Jackson.
Detlef Schrempf.
Yeah, the tall, pasty white fellow named Rick Smits. It was a really hard series. The Bulls were trailing the fourth quarter of Game 7 in that series going into it, and they ended up winning. But yeah, for sure, you can see everybody kind of besides Jordan in this game is beat. Like, I mean, either literally injured or just exhausted. And there are moments in this game where you can see Jordan's beat. Like, it's truly like a war of attrition, especially as physical as the NBA used to be. Like, you can that's kind of the trade-off that we see from this era of the NBA to now, is that like, this era of the NBA has more points. It's more fun to watch. It's definitely less physical. There's less hand checking, but a lot of the way Jordan scores points in this game, which we'll get into, is just attrition, like running at the basket and drawing a foul and just physically getting beat up, willing to get beat up over and over again to score points.
Yeah, and we learn throughout his career that he ends up putting on more muscle to be that type of player, to endure those types of games, which end up paying off. He's 34 years old in this game. And yeah, he just outlasts everybody. And they mentioned it in the broadcast about how, when everybody's exhausted, he somehow finds a way to take it to another level. And that's kind of always been the thing that they've said about Jordan, right? I mean, they mentioned it in the episode about the Dream Team that I just watched. About how that he can find that level to beat these guys, to outwork these guys, which is crazy, because it's the talent and the drive to be so great. So with that, I do want to talk about Michael Jordan a little bit before running through the recap of this game, because it's so interesting to me, and we've mentioned it on the podcast before, but I grew up in Maryland and rooted for the hometown teams, so that being the Orioles and the Ravens when they arrived into town. Later on in life, I became a hockey fan and started rooting for the Washington Capitals. Interestingly, though, Patrick, in the mid 90s, as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old, I wore Jordan shoes, and I had a Michael Jordan poster in my room, and I loved Space Jam, and I wore a Jordan jersey in third grade. I distinctly remember that. It's so weird for me to look back at that time in life and think, what was I doing wearing Chicago Bulls stuff? But that's who Michael Jordan was at this time, right? He transcended all of that. And the whole thing about being a hometown fan, it didn't matter. Everybody was a Michael Jordan fan.
The only two athletes that I can think of in that way, and it's a totally different sport, would be him and Tiger, probably. Of just like, if you're a fan of the sport, you're a fan of them. Because I was the same way. I grew up a Knicks fan. I was a Knicks fan my whole life. I had a Jordan poster in my bedroom. I had a Jordan jersey, and I wanted Jordans. Like, there will never be a guy like him again who so singularly captures, like, he was the guy. There weren't other shoes. Like, by this point, other people had shoe models, but you wanted Jordans. Like, there was nothing that compared to Jordans. There was no player that compared to Jordan. There was nobody with the all the advertisements, all the endorsements that Jordan had. Like, he was the NBA. It was him and everybody else in the NBA, and then really in every other sport. He was a brand. I mean, he is a brand. He literally has his own brand now, which is the Jordan brand. But even before that, when he was just with Nike, I mean, Michael Jordan was. I think this would be different in the age of social media, where there's so many people to kind of take people down and write more stuff like the Jordan Rules book that Sam Smith wrote that kind of brought up negative things about Jordan. He was just kind of like almost like a godlike figure in basketball, of just like he was the guy. There were very few negative things written about him. He didn't say much to ruffle anybody's feathers. He was just the perfect brand for anybody to attach to.
Yeah, he was. We had the Be Like Mike campaign, right, Jab, and that, I think that kind of emphasized a lot of why people really liked him. And I have to be honest, Jab, rewatching or watching The Last Dance for the first time kind of emphasizes why I felt that way. I don't think my opinion of Michael Jordan has changed any, right? There's not a ton of controversy. The guy likes to gamble. He likes to smoke cigars. But the bottom line about his career is that he just wanted to win, right? He just wanted to win championships. And I think everything he did was motivated by that. And that's a huge part of the reason why, as a kid and now as an adult, it's easy to get behind a guy like that. I still want to wear Jordans, and I am still watching this broadcast, which is rooting against him and rooting for Jordan in this game. That hasn't changed for me at all. And then when everybody comes together in the dream team, and that's another way of bringing everybody together and uniting the country if you are a fan base that doesn't root for Michael Jordan.
So to be just totally transparent, I've been a Laker fan all my life. I've grew up with the Lakers. It was in San Diego. We had the Clippers. They started in San Diego. They moved to LA. I never really got behind it. I was always Byron Scott was my guy. Played for the Lakers back in the 80s. So I've been following the Magic Bird thing. I knew Jordan when he was at Carolina. I remember the shot against Georgetown. It's kind of like at the beginning of my sports fandom, and I was a basketball player. So that was my number one sport. I loved basketball. I played basketball. I thought I was going to the league. Nick Van Exel, my favorite Laker, until number 8, number 24, however you want to call it, comes in and becomes where I'm at, right? So Kobe is my guy. Kobe's a guy that I watched, and every time I would watch him, I would think of one thing. And it was Jordan, and all the little mannerisms that he would do, even to where, if you notice in the documentary, he puts his hands on his knees all the time. I used to do that because I thought I was being like Mike, right? Like in games and or recs or whatever you were playing, you would just kind of do that same thing, and that was your way of just kind of thinking you were like Mike. You started to try to do the moves. I would do dunk contests in our backyard when I had hops.
Did you ever stick your tongue out while you were shooting?
Oh, I can do the side jam better than anybody in the country. I have mastered that side jam, bring it over the top. I mean, it's one of my favorite jams. And the cradle dunk. And so like all these things that you're talking about, I look at in such a great time in my life, mid-20s, like peak basketball, like just loving this thing, watching these series go back and forth. But when you guys start talking about Jordan, the brand, it's so like brings me back to, we don't have anything like that now. Like Tiger became that, and I think that's a great comp, Patrick, because Tiger is a figure as opposed to just a golfer, right? I think Tiger's probably a terrible human being, right? off the he just probably is, right? So were a lot of people that were that great. Okay, there's people like that, and I heard this analogy. Magic Johnson is like a buddy guy on their team, okay? I think Shaquille O'Neal is almost that, like a buddy guy too. I don't think Jordan could be friends with people and have that thing and then be able to still push them, which is where it gets back to Kobe, and I think Kobe is in that same vein as well. He might not have a lot of friends. You bet you have a lot of close friends, but I mean, I think in the end, these guys are so driven that's what happens, and that's the reason why these teams win like they do, and especially with Jordan. But when you guys talk about the brand itself, when we would talk about shoes back in the 90s, it wasn't like what kind of shoes you're getting, what kind of Jordans are you getting? It became almost like, like a verb, basically. Like you're saying like, oh, you're going to get some Jordans, like you're going to go do that, like what kind of Jordans are you getting? And that just meant what kind of shoes you were going to get. So yes, it crossed over and it became a brand as opposed just to a name.
Yeah, and it's amazing that really still lives on today. I just got a pair of Jordan 1s, before we even knew that we were going to be doing this podcast. So,
and you haven't even put them on eBay yet.
That's not happening. No. Although I've seen that everybody and their brother's trying to buy some Jordan 1s. Episode 5 of The Last Dance, focusing on him going back to Madison Square Garden and putting the 1s on and playing in those things, even though he said his feet were bleeding so bad because shoe technology had increased a lot since the 80s when those came out. So,
and Zach, remember who gave you those shoes? You got to give that guy a shout out.
Yeah, that'd be my parents, my mom and dad sent me those shoes.
Crowbar him in the show every time. I love it.
They've been sending pictures and texts about some of the other Jordans that I had as a kid. My dad was like, "You had the 4s," and he's sending me pictures, and I'm like, "That's awesome."
You had the 4s and the 11s.
Awesome. That's super cool.
The best. I love him.
Super cool. I love it. So. All right, I feel like we've set this game up pretty well, so why don't we jump in and run through what actually happens in the game itself. The place that I want to start, and we talked about this before doing the pod, and I want to give plenty of time to it here on the show, is the broadcast itself. And if you have listened to our podcast, we have been very complimentary of the broadcasts for the 2001 World Series, for Super Bowl 34, for the Miracle on Ice. I mean, we've had, I guess it's just Joe Buck and Al Michaels on the call. But, some really great broadcasters and some really huge moments that I think did a fantastic job. This was, of the ones that we've done, the first time that as I'm watching it, I am actively texting Patrick and Jab about how much I dislike this broadcast. And I really, I'm rooting for the Bulls and we know what's going to happen, but you've got Bob Costas and Isaiah Thomas doing this broadcast, and it is so clear that obviously Isaiah doesn't want Michael Jordan to win because those two guys hate each other. Still to this day, they hate each other. But you can hear the disdain that Costas has for Dennis Rodman, which gets to be a little bit exhausting. And Jordan hits the shot, and it's not my favorite call. I don't think that the energy's there at the end of the game. Rather than replaying Jordan's game winner, they go back and replay the shot that the Jazz missed to lose the game. And it's like, it felt to me, Jab, like everybody was over the Bulls at this point. And I don't know if that started with Isaiah Thomas. I imagine it's probably hard having a color commentator who hates the star of the Bulls. I don't know if it started and ended with them or if everybody was just kind of over Chicago winning so many championships at this point in history.
All right, I'll take you back real quick here. I don't know if it's as much that they were rooting against the Bulls per se. I think it's more that people were dying for the Jazz to finally get one. There was a big groundswell at that time for the Jazz, especially coming off the loss that they had the year before. How many times have you heard Malone and Stockton are the two best players that have not won? Like they had this, Charles Barkley type mentality where, we have to be the ones to do it. The Jazz, for some reason, was that team you kind of rooted for if you were a basketball purist. So, like, you loved the passing, the pick and roll. They started with the pick and roll, and Malone was this big hulking figure that kind of had a pretty good personality, and so people really liked him and embraced him in an area of, I wouldn't call, let's just call Utah not that diverse. Right. But yet it's really, really great with what they've done with the basketball team and how much they love it. And it's one of those arenas that you just kind of, as a as a player, as a fan of another team like the Lakers, I hated to go into the Delta Center. I didn't care how good the team was. The coach was really good. Jerry Sloan was easy to root for. I think it was more that, Zach, and it could be a little bit of the hatred for Rodman too. I think people at that point were just starting to get tired of Rodman's act. And kind of like, think about it. And Pippen, kind of what his act was all about and not being able to come into the game. And so they had some people you didn't like Krause, right? But you wanted to see this team win. So it is a lot of factors. The one that I think is interesting that you point out when you said about Rodman and then Costas late in the third quarter, I think it was, there's that tie up and Rodman goes down and then he trips Malone. And Malone, by the way, is part of that too. If you watch that, Malone's doing it too.
Oh, it's mutual.
He talks about, and then Costas in this smarmy way says, well, yeah, and he's supposed to wrestle him later on this summer. And I don't know why Carl would lower himself to do something like this. You can see, Patrick, the vitriol that these guys had for him. But I think that's more, and see if I'm wrong, Patrick, was it more that the people wanted the Jazz to win, or do you think it was more that the announcers really, outside Isaiah, really disliked Jordan? Because Ahmad Rashad loved Jordan, clearly.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think I agree. I think I remember Malone being like this big gregarious guy who was always very friendly with the media. Obviously Stockton, one of the great, point guards of ever, super underrated, even as a Hall of Famer. But I also think at this point, like the Bulls were transparently very tired of the media in general. To an extent, I get it. Like to be on Michael Jordan's team for however, to be Michael Jordan or to be on Michael Jordan's team for, what was in total 6 years. It's just a circus traveling around all the time. And especially with this year of just constantly getting asked, are you retiring? Is Phil coming back? The same questions over and over again. Jordan just started no commenting people. And Jordan had a prickly relationship with some media people. Obviously, I mean, if you've seen in The Last Dance, like he stopped talking to Sports Illustrated after they ran that baseball cover. Scottie Pippen, when he was asking for a trade, kind of had an embargo with the media, wouldn't talk to them anymore. And obviously, you have Rodman, who is quite a tricky person to understand at the very least. So I don't think the Bulls were very well liked amongst the media. Like I think I don't want to say it's on the level of like Barry Bonds or anything like that, but people weren't rooting for them because it's not like people were getting great stories for them, or they were super friendly with the media in general. And I agree, like the first thing I thought when I heard this broadcast, I'm like, oh my God, that's Isaiah Thomas. I cannot believe Isaiah Thomas is on the call for this game. Not only because I think he's a terrible play-by-play guy. That's just one thing. But like, I can't even think of like a parallel to have, like, who would you have in another sport on a broadcast of just like, they so transparently dislike the main figure in this game. And on the other side of the table, you have Doug Collins, who was Jordan's coach in the, I believe, late 80s before Phil Jackson, maybe even early 90s. And I think he still had a good relationship with Jordan.
Oh, yeah.
And
they're tight.
And, yeah, obviously the whole Costas Rodman thing was bizarre and just like, dude, Karl Malone likes wrestling too. What do you mean you don't know why Karl Malone would lower himself to that? He likes wrestling. He wasn't forced into it. He's a guy. He's from like rural Louisiana. Like it all checks out.
Patrick, did you have an opportunity to go back and watch the Rodman Malone matchup in the WCW? Because I remember this game. I totally remember being a huge fan of the WCW and this whole thing happening.
I'm glad you brought this up. So was I. I didn't get a chance to go back and watch it, but I distinctly, this is like one of the most distinct like wrestling memories I have when I was a kid, because when Rodman first went on that wrestling show, he skipped a Bulls practice to do it. Like he just didn't show up. And I remember watching like WCW Nitro on Monday and being like, what is Dennis Rodman doing here? Like, what is going on? And then all of a sudden it was a feud with Karl Malone, which was just like, unlike anything I'd ever seen. Like I knew obviously like Mr. T had been involved in like the 80s with Hulk Hogan, or like Mike Tyson was involved in WWF, but like seeing those two guys like in the middle of their careers, not at the end of their careers, in the middle of their careers and in the middle of the season, like just being involved in a wrestling match really adds a layer to this of just like throughout the game, you can see even though they're kind of like jawing at each other and like jostling with each other, you can even hear Rodman at one point. I think there's a foul called on him, and Malone's kind of jawing at him. And Rodman says to the ref, he goes, "He knows me. He knows my name. He knows me really well." Talking about Malone. And they're wrestling with each other the whole time. It's super physical. They're both super physical players, but they're also like kind of like slapping each other on the ass.
Yep.
They're you can see like they're friendly with each other. Two guys with completely opposite personalities, especially if you know Malone. Malone's kind of like a further right wing guy. Rodman is obviously totally the opposite of that, but they obviously respect each other a lot. And it's so funny to see two very different guys coming together in the game and kind of like having these fun moments every once in a while.
And I thought that's why the call was so frustrating, right? Because it just makes – I understand that Dennis Rodman is polarizing. The guy still is, right? I mean, I get it. But – the broadcast was making this out to be like he was out there throwing punches at Malone, who, did nothing to deserve it. And then they do replays, and it's like, no, that's not what's happening. This is a mutual. And I know that that's the way that Rodman played defense too. I mean, the Last Dance highlights that a lot. And these guys before Rodman came to Chicago, they freaking hated the way that he played, and then obviously embraced him as a strong part of their defense. But it makes it out to be this completely one-sided thing, and that just was not the case. And I think it is worth mentioning too, Jab, that the whole Isaiah Thomas thing with Michael Jordan, this whole thing goes back a long way, which is why it's kind of a joke having him on this broadcast. So the Bulls finally beat the Pistons in the 1991 Eastern Conference Finals. The Pistons had their number for a long while. They finally get through. The Pistons walk off the court before the game's over. There's like 7 seconds left, and rather than shake hands and congratulate him for finally getting through, and that dynasty really starting in Chicago, they take the low road and walk off the floor. And they ask Isaiah Thomas about it. He said, yeah, well, hey, in '88 when we beat the Celtics, that's what they did too. That was the way things were back then, right? So they asked Jordan about that in The Last Dance, and he's rolling his eyes, talking about how he can say whatever he wants to say. That wasn't a real great move on his part. That's not what sportsmanship is about. Then you get to the Dream Team in 1992, and hey, no Isaiah Thomas on that team. Everybody's blaming Michael Jordan because everybody knows that Jordan and Isaiah hate each other. And Jordan still says now, to this day, nope, I didn't say Isaiah couldn't be on this team, but Isaiah doesn't believe that still to this day. And it's just crazy to me that they would have the guy's arch enemy on the broadcast of, likely the last game of his career.
Well, here's the thing too with Isaiah Thomas. One, he's awful on the he was terrible broadcaster. He was even worse when he went and tried to ruin Patrick's Knicks. He was awful. It was a bad pairing in general. You could have had Collins and Costas do that. And if you remember, the old guy Peter Vesey was also a great sideline reporter at that time too, who was one of the NBC guys. And then Ahmad Rashad clearly was in Jordan's back pocket. But when it comes to the Dream Team thing, I've heard from plenty of people that I trust in the basketball community, Rod Thorne, who was part of that team, who was actually the guy who drafted Jordan, even saying when they went and did this, there wasn't just like one person saying who makes the team. Also remember, Magic Johnson and Isaiah Thomas were quote unquote best friends. Magic still had a very strong stranglehold on that, on the culture and who got on that team and who didn't get on that team. And if Magic really wanted Isaiah to get on that team, I guarantee he could have went to Michael and said, hey, listen, this guy would help us. If you look at the construction of that team, there's not a spot for Isaiah because they had a couple point guards already on that team, John Stockton being one who was much better as a facilitator. Because you got to remember, Isaiah was more of a scoring point guard, right? So they didn't need another bunch of scorers on that team. They had freaking Larry Bird. They had, Chris Mullin. They had Jordan. It was loaded with players. So there really wasn't a spot for him on that. It is interesting. I'll say this. Isaiah Thomas should send a fruit basket, money, cocktails, whatever, some cigars to Jordan, because Jordan is making Isaiah Thomas relevant again because most people definitely forgot about him.
That's definitely true. Yeah, I'm sitting here talking about him, and
Right.
definitely wouldn't be if not for watching The Last Dance. All right, let's talk about the action.
Very unlikable. He's very unlikable.
Yeah, watch this broadcast. You'll feel the same way.
And, sorry, really quick. Back to that thing when they walked off. That didn't happen. If you go back and look, the Celtics did.
Yep.
Larry goes back and actually gives a handshake there. And the person that had everybody leave at that time was Bill Laimbeer. Let that sink in. Look up Bill Laimbeer and what a great guy that guy was. I'm not shocked that he was the one that told everybody to walk it off. 'Cause I guarantee you, Vinnie Johnson or some of those classy guys on that team wouldn't have done that.
All right, let's jump into the game. First quarter, so we see immediately in this game that Scottie Pippen is hurting bad, right? He gets on the board quick with a dunk, and they're talking about how he might have already tweaked that back. And watching him run up and down the court, Jab, it's clear that he is in a ton of pain, and that's going to play a huge role in how things play out in this game.
Yeah, and the thing is, too, with Scottie, at that time, everybody thought Scottie was soft, right? You've heard that so many times, him not going into games later. The whole deal that was going on with Scottie. He's a migraine. He's got an ankle. He always looks like he's hurt. So it's tough to think about that he's some type of, in this way, in such a big, crucial game. Because remember, this series, there was only one blowout in this series. All the other games were 5 points or less. So small plays here and there, which we'll talk about here in the first quarter, which I think is still a big play. I know it's in a basketball game. It's not as big, but in the end, it does make a difference. So Scottie going out, all I thought about, Patrick, was watching this game, it's going to have to be on Jordan's shoulders to have to shoot a lot. And in my opinion, I loved watching Jordan take over games. So for me, when Scottie went out, I was like, all right, good. I get to watch more Jordan.
Yeah, dude, I felt bad for Scottie. I did not. I mean, obviously, Zach and I were 10 when this happened.
10, yep.
10 years old. So I don't remember this. Like I remember at the game. I remember the shot. I remember the Bulls won the game, but I don't remember Scottie just being like, Scottie's almost an afterthought in this game. Like, he does have a couple big contributions at key points to kind of like, stop a run that the Jazz are on. But for the most part, it's just him going back and forth to the locker room, obviously in a ton of pain. And Jab, I'm glad you brought it up. Like, there was obviously the game that he sat out when Tony Kukoc got the last shot, which is
by the way, he made it.
Yeah, he did, which is a little different. But what I think of is the migraine game, which we all mentioned. Of just like, this is kind of another moment like that, of just like, this could have been such a bad, unfortunate moment for Scottie, because anybody who's ever had a back injury, of just like, you can't move. Not only can you not like play a basketball game, it's just difficult to like stand up and sit down. You can see he's in a lot of pain. The previous game, he went 2 of 16 from the field, so I'm guessing he probably wasn't feeling too great then either. So yeah, that was one thing I noticed from the first quarter, and the other main thing that I noticed is the Bulls have no answer for Karl Malone, and I forgot how good Karl Malone was.
Yeah, he really dominated this first quarter, and it's amazing that it finished as tight as it was, because it looked like all Utah in the first quarter, and I think Jordan kind of helped keep him in check there. You're going back to Scottie and talking about that injury, and Jab, I know you mentioned the ankle injury, and he didn't start the season, and a big part of that whole thing was that Scottie held off on doing surgery on that until the season, was underway. So he could have taken care of that over the summer and started the year with them, but given his contract situation, decided, I don't think so. I'm going to take, however long off to get this thing taken care of. And I know that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
Including Michael Jordan, definitely.
They were very dependent on Dennis Rodman in the early part of that year without Scottie. That combined with the fact that, I think there were some people that thought he was soft, but my goodness, just watching him run up and down the court was painful for me. He's taking these soft steps, and every time he goes up, you're like just cringing watching it happen. The Bulls finished.
And the other thing that,
go ahead.
I was going to say, the one thing that's big for that too is not just him offensively. Scottie was the best defender that they had, and if he was going to have to, what they were doing too is what they were trying to do is he was, I think at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, if he was guarding Hornacek because he was kind of just coming off those screens, but when they would switch those screens, he was able to double on Malone because they, like you said, they had no answer for Malone. Rodman had no shot, so that was huge defensively, and for them to be able to keep the game still close without Scottie in the first period really kind of set the tone for the rest of the game.
And it's when you see that dunk, literally like the only thing that he does in the first quarter, the first thing I thought was, wow, Scottie Pippen playing against Jeff Hornacek is a problem for Utah. Like, Scottie Pippen is a supreme athlete, like one of the best, 30 to 40 players of all time. How is Utah going to guard Scottie Pippen? And the only way is he got hurt. Like, it's like Hornacek would have been in a world of trouble trying to guard a fully healthy Scottie Pippen for the entire game.
Pippen ends up leaving with around 5 minutes left in the first quarter. A lot of speculation about whether we'll see him again, given how rough he was looking early on in this game. The Bulls do go on a 9-0 run at the end of the first quarter, but Jordan misses the final shot of the quarter. In the end, Utah leads after one, 25-22. And Utah responded quickly there, Jab, by going on a 17-5 run to finish things up in the quarter.
Yeah, the other thing, too, in that quarter, and I think you have it here in the rundown, and I have it written down, there is a big shot that happens. Was that second quarter, though, with the shot by Howard Eisley?
Yeah, that's the second quarter.
Yeah, second quarter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first quarter, the Bulls really did a pretty good job of kind of keeping it, like I said, keeping it as close as they could. I do remember, too, is there was a lot of missed shots by the Jazz. A couple bunnies that they could have got. They struggled inside. But overall, you could see the flow of the game was heading towards Utah based on two things. One, without Pippen being in there, that changes the game a little bit, too, right? You got to look at different guys getting open. Number two, the other thing that stood out to me, guys, is how much and Patrick talked about in the rundown, Stockton was definitely not up to his normal speed and even coming off screens. He was so good because he was so accurate at the things that he did well, right? He's one of those guys. I call it like Miguel Gonzalez, had to be perfect every time he pitched. And when he was perfect, he was really good. He had no margin of error. And I feel like Stockton had that margin of error, and he struggled. It seemed like to me he was struggling from where, the John Stockton at the height of his powers.
Yeah, that's the quiet part of this game that they kind of don't mention as much as Scottie, because he's not going to the locker room as much. But not only, is he one of the great assist men of all time. I forget if he still holds the record for assists or not, but steals as well. Like he was. Yes. He knew passing lanes. He was a defensive presence for being kind of a smaller, thinner guy, but he could create a lot of problems on defense. And not having him at the peak of his powers really turned this into, as you saw at the end of the first quarter, this turned into Jordan versus Malone, which for periods was awesome to watch. Just two guys just literally just pulling every move that they had and the kitchen sink out to try and score and match the other guy on the other end.
So second quarter gets underway. Chicago's called, as Patrick mentioned, for their fourth illegal defense, which was something that I had to be reminded of because, like you said, Patrick, it no longer exists.
Can't play zone.
So the fourth illegal defense called early on in the second quarter. Here's the play that Jab was talking about and a really big moment. So Jazz are leading 28-24, just under 10 minutes left in the second quarter. Jazz guard Howard Eisley saves a pass that almost went out of bounds. As the shot clock is running down, Antoine Carr passes the ball across to Shandon Anderson. The ball flies over Anderson's hand. Howard Eisley catches the ball, and he hits a three-pointer, but the referee ruled that it was a shot clock violation, right? So replays show that Eisley's shot came before the shot clock expired, but replay doesn't exist in the NBA until 2002. So this is a 3-point 3 points that could have swung in their favor. Again, Jazz leading 28-24, so it would have been a 7-point game had they gotten this call correct. Jazz coach Jerry Sloan had already received a technical in the first quarter, so he didn't really argue it that much, kind of fearing that another technical would get him thrown out of this game. A really big moment in this game, though, Jab, and looking back at the history of this game, a lot of people point to some missed calls that really went in favor of the Bulls.
Yeah, they definitely did, and that was definitely in. It was a great shot. It was a momentum shifter too. But the referees in this game were some of the best in there. I think Crawford was in this game. The guy who actually called it off I forgot his name, but he's a referee who's well thought of in NBA community. So I really couldn't be more odd. It was just an odd sequence because, like you said, Sloan would usually just come out of it. But I think it's great you pointed out that he got that technical earlier. And last thing you need to do is lose your coach in a elimination game. The quarter itself was interesting. How kind of it went back and forth, right? But the other thing that you said is like Costas talked about it a little bit, but again, it goes back to what you were talking about. It's almost like it was almost offensive to Costas that they didn't let that go. You know what I mean? Like in the moment, I think he was also getting caught up with the crowd too.
Oh, yeah, and we should mention that. I know you guys have mentioned the crowd noise, but there are a lot of moments in this broadcast where the commentators are yelling because it's so loud talking over the crowd noise. I mean, this arena is crazy, and that's it hasn't been overstated, especially in the pregame. Man, it's hard to hear what these guys are saying standing down on the court. But a big moment and a missed call, and it does end up going the Bulls' way. And without Pippen on the court, I wrote down a quote here that Costas mentions, and he just says, how much more of the load can Jordan carry? And Jordan really gets going in the second quarter. 14 of his 23 points so far had come in the second quarter, Patrick. A very physical game. We see him and Malone going back and forth in the final minutes of the second quarter, but Utah ends up finishing strong, and it's 49-45 Jazz at the half.
This is the most watchable quarter.
Yeah.
The third and fourth quarters have the drama. Like there are some great moments in the fourth. Obviously, the last sequence with Jordan, which we're going to get to later, is unbelievable. But this is when the teams are clicking. Like everybody kind of seems like they get a little bit of a second wind here, and this is Jordan versus Malone at its peak. Like both doing what they're known for doing. Malone drawing a ton of fouls, a great free throw shooter, which was rare for a guy as big as he was in that time, stepping back and making a couple jumpers, and Jordan just putting Byron Russell in an absolute washing machine and just showing him like all of the moves that he's got, the fadeaways. He steps through for a layup at one point, and I was wondering the same thing, and I wrote it down to him, like, if Jordan isn't absolutely on fire, this game is over, because nobody else was getting the ball. Tony Kukoc, I think, had maybe one or two baskets. Judd Bushler had one. But for the most part, this is all Michael Jordan, just willing his team to even be close in this game. And it's amazing to watch. Like you forget how great he was without. I mean, there was nobody out there. There's nobody out there to score the ball. It's him, like Tony Kukoc, Rodman, Steve Kerr, who I don't think takes a shot in this game. Luke Longley and Bill Wennington rotating in.
Kerr really gets beat up on in this broadcast too. That was another thing. They were really dogging on his abilities too, which was kind of driving me nuts.
Yeah, he played 24 minutes and had 3 assists, no points. So I mean that's kind of big. He struggled. He really struggled in the series overall. The one guy that did help a little bit, Patrick, was Kukoc. He had actually a really good game for him and the things he was doing.
Yeah, I really thought he helped keep them in this game without Pippen. I mean, the numbers don't show anything super impressive, and obviously it is the Michael Jordan show, but I thought he helped keep their heads above water in the first 2 quarters. Even
so, he's the only threat. He's like, there's nobody. What, are you going to step out on Bill Wennington when he's got the ball 20 feet from the basket? No, you're just going to
don't sleep on my guy Ron Harper. Don't sleep on Harper.
Ron Harper didn't do anything either. It was, but yeah, Kukoc is the one guy. And here's the one note that I do want to mention that blew me away because it's just so unlike today now. In the era of like load management and kind of like, for example, Kawhi Leonard taking a couple games off to make sure he's fresh for the playoffs. Bob Costas just casually mentioned Michael Jordan hasn't missed a game since he came back from baseball. A single game. He hasn't missed a game in 3.5 seasons. He played like the back end of the bowl season of the playoffs when they lost to the Magic, and then just 82 finals all the way through, which is ridiculous. Yeah. Like, I can't imagine how tired this guy is at this point.
And he's 32, 33, and 34 years old in those seasons.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's nuts. It would not happen today.
No, and even with guys and the comparable too is think about the guys nowadays and how the game is played. It's such a different game. You see Jordan getting into the post and doing turnarounds. You don't see that now. Very rarely do you see guys do that now, it's more, it's a 3-point game. I get it. Everything evolves. Basketball evolves. The analytics got involved. But in this game, if you want to just pure old school Peachtree basketball, that's what you got, really, because it was the whole idea of getting Jordan to his spot, which was right there, the corner elbow, and being able to do what he wanted to do at that point. And that's kind of how the triangle ran. But it was amazing how they would try to double, triple, whatever you tried to do, he was turning around, making shots. And Patrick and Zach as well, if you play basketball, getting layups is one thing. That gets you going and everything. But having to do turnarounds and having to basically jump as high as you can so that you can get it above the defender that's usually taller than you, and to be able to make these shots on a consistent basis after, like you said, playing 82 games and 3 grueling series to get here, and now you're in game 6, which turns out you're not that healthy either. How crazy is that, and how nowadays I just can't see it happen.
I do remember specifically like it being talked about when Jordan came back from baseball, maybe like a year afterwards, because he didn't have the crazy athletic ability that he used to anymore. He wasn't like the most athletic player in the league anymore. I remember him like somebody saying like, oh, he got the turnaround. Like all of a sudden, like, and Kobe did the same thing to his credit. When he got older, Kobe stopped trying to get by people with pure athleticism and just developed a post-up game. And it's all you see from Jordan in this game is just bullying people in the post, and the turnaround is just automatic. And it's something he developed later in his career, and it's what great players do. I'm just like, oh, I don't have the athleticism anymore. It's kind of like a pitcher not having like the full velocity anymore, of just being like, all right, how do I still get people out without having the best stuff? Jordan just developed maybe the best post game for a guy who wasn't a forward in the history of basketball.
Yeah, these guys adapt. The great ones adapt, and you're definitely seeing it here. The third quarter is ugly. Scottie Pippen does return to the floor.
But not really.
But not
he's
really.
There.
No.
He's there, but not really.
He's not doing a whole lot. He's
like the guy. He's like the fans, the fake fans of the KBO.
He's pointing. He's standing on the weak side of, like, away from the action and just pointing.
He's
like,
a decoy.
I followed him for like 3 possessions, just pointing at people. Yep. Like, all right, there he is.
Completely a decoy in this third quarter. It's super sloppy. Tons of fouls. The Bulls have 4 fouls 3 minutes into the third quarter. Rodman and Malone continuing to go back and forth. This was that moment that Jab talked about where they're both on the floor shoving each other, and Costas is talking about that this is when he brings up the WCW matchup that they have coming up in a couple weeks.
And why would Carl lower himself to do something like that? By the way, after that play too, they're both patting each other on the asses too, like, hey, you got it, I got you. It was almost a wrestling type promo. If you look at it, it wasn't like there was any punches or anything throw.
Nope.
One guy fake tripped the other guy fake tripped the other guy. It was great. It was great theater.
And credit to the referees for letting them play this physical, right? I mean, I felt like it was pretty fairly called between the two. I think they were both playing, very physical games, despite, how the broadcast presented it. And they let them play, let both sides play, which can get really annoying when referees jump in and try to change that, especially in a game where the stakes are so high. But that was when this moment took place, was in the third quarter. It ends up being 66-61 for Utah at the end. Jordan, we can see, it was really starting to get gas. He goes 1 of 9 to finish the quarter. Anything else to add in the third, guys? This one was very sloppy, lots of fouls, very physical, and we're maybe thinking that the tank has run out of gas for Jordan.
I'd say the one noticeable development that I saw in the third quarter is the doubling of Malone got a lot more aggressive. Yeah. Like the Bulls had enough of Malone just getting every big guy they had in foul trouble and just, picking up free points at the free throw line, or he was destroying them. So all of a sudden they start posting Malone up in the third quarter, and the second guy comes immediately. Sometimes a third guy. I mean, they'd send everybody at Karl Malone to make somebody else beat them. And it's a strategic change from what they had been doing in the first and second quarter. They'd send a guy, but he'd hedge a little bit. He wouldn't be all the way there. Once Malone touches the ball in the third quarter, there are 2 people on him. And that's a change that kind of stayed for the rest of the game.
Yeah, and I think they continue to contain him pretty well in the fourth quarter too, Jab. We kind of see the Jazz kind of ease up a little bit, and I think that's a credit to what the Bulls were able to do defensively. So why don't we jump into the fourth quarter? It's 77-77, just under 5 minutes left. Rodman's at the free throw line. He hits one of his 2 free throws, and it's a foul by Malone because these two are going back and forth. We see Bulls guard Ron Harper make a jump shot as the shot clock went off, tie the game at 79. And this is another one where it looks like, Jab, the referees might have missed this. The replay shows that shot clock might have expired. Costas kind of goes back and references the missed call on Isley's shot in the first half, and a little bit of controversy with some of the calls. But again, this is the days before instant replay. Review, I should say.
More and more I think about this, the more and more that you bring this up, I'm thinking Costas might have had some cash, like an Al Michaels type wager on this game, Patrick. I mean, he really is going hard. Now, I know what he wants. Back in those days, too, everybody always talked about the conspiracy theory was what? Always want a Game 7. The NBA sets these up. It's always got to go to Game 7, blah, blah, blah. I get it. I don't think that was the case at all. I'm not a big conspiracy theory guy. But I will say games were called differently at different times by different referees. Clearly the Donaghy documentary that came out, that was an interesting one. But I think in basketball, it's one of the sports that it's very difficult, in my opinion, to have everybody in on something and do that. I do find it interesting, though, that you keep going back with the Costas. And the more and more I listen to this, Costas did have maybe a small wager, a little money line wager on the Jazz, Patrick.
I think, and the thing is, in this quarter, too, you can kind of see finally Malone starts running out of gas.
Mm-hmm.
Like he picks it up towards the end. Like he has a couple huge plays towards the end of the game, and dude, he deserved better. Like if he had gotten a competent, kind of second banana performance from anybody, Hornacek had an okay game. Howard Isley had a couple moments. If Stockton's healthy, they probably win this game because Malone was a force for, the better part of 3 quarters. But you can see him start missing shots. He gets frustrated. He fouls Rodman. That's what sends Rodman to the line. It just kind of gets into the end game. And the end game is what kind of brings this game back around. Because like you said, Zach, the third quarter is ugly. The first part of the fourth quarter is kind of ugly. Jordan just cannot get something to go down for the entire first part of the fourth quarter. And really the fourth quarter to me is he finally gets some help. Finally, Ron Harper makes a shot or two. Kukoc starts getting a little hot. And the cavalry arrives really just in time for Jordan to keep the Bulls in this game. Yeah,
absolutely.
The other thing, Zach, too, is he gets to the line. And that takes there's 2 things in regard to that with the line. One is there's rest. Right. So he gets to sit there. 2, he was a fantastic free throw shooter, 12 of 15. But it's also a way to get yourself. You always hear that the analysts say that best way to get a guy going is to just have him make a couple buckets, whether it's layups or free throws. He's getting to the line and kind of slowing the game down, which also brings the crowd out of it a little bit as they're at the line, too. So he does a great job of starting to kind of chip away, just continue to chip away and keep it close.
Yeah, and he does just that to tie it at 83. He ties it with 2 free throws, just under a minute to go. So we're just under a minute left in this game. This one things really get crazy. Stockton hits a 3 to go up 86-83 Jazz. Then Jordan really quickly responds on a layup in the next possession. 37.1 seconds left, and Utah's up 86-85.
Awful defense on that play. First of all, they need to get a quick one, Patrick, there, right? And Jordan, what do you want to take away? You want to take away his right side. They let him go right. There's no help on the other side because, as you pointed out, Karl Malone is just basically gassed, right? He gets by. I think Russell is guarding him at the time. He gets by him and gets that easy bucket. And even in the broadcast, I think even your boy, doesn't he say that? Does your boy Zay Thomas says something like you got to get the ball out of his hands. They don't come and double him, Patrick. They didn't do anything to change. It's almost like they just expected that they were going to score on the other end, but Jordan had other things in mind.
There are 3 good Isaiah moments in this game, and that's one of them. And this one is really just pointing out the obvious. The other one to me is when the Rodman kind of like wrestling match or whatever you want to call it with Malone happens on the ground. He actually has knowledge of Rodman. He was a teammate of Rodman. And it's obvious, but he's he's trying to get in Malone's head.
Yep.
And you're like, oh yeah, duh. Like that's obviously why that's happening. So there's that moment. There's this moment with the, obviously he's just like, you gotta force the ball out of Michael Jordan's
I think
hands.
Penny could have got to figure that one out.
I will say the last couple minutes, the two things that I noticed, Pippen has a couple big moments. He makes a couple post entry passes. He makes like two kind of like those little hook shots in the post. So he has a big impact towards the end of this game. And Utah goes exclusively to Stockton, which is really interesting to me because he was just a kind of like on the periphery of this game. And then down the stretch, it is all Stockton. He misses a shot, then he makes the three, and then they go to him again at the end. And this last sequence encapsulates like it's a perfect ending for Michael Jordan. You could just pretend that the Wizards thing didn't happen because the last minute here is exactly how Michael Jordan's career should end.
It's amazing. So he hits that layup, 37.1 seconds left. The Bulls are down by one. It's 86-85. And then Jordan steals from Karl Malone. He's guarded by Byron Russell. He drives inside the three-point line, does a quick crossover, maybe pushing off of Russell.
Definitely pushed off.
Then he drains a 20-footer, 5.2 seconds left to play. The Bulls are up 87-86. So that's the shot. That is the shot. That's the one everybody remembers. So what do we think? We got to talk about the push-off. Was it okay to not call that? How much controversy is involved in that? I don't know. I try to look past that and just, kind of think about the greatness of this moment and this last minute being the Michael Jordan show and sealing that sixth championship. We'll start with you, Patrick.
I am totally fine with the push off. And Isaiah, you know what? To me, this is the best moment that Isaiah has is he mentions it because nobody else does. Because, and in my opinion, it's pretty obvious. Jordan pushed off Russell's leg. But he also says that's part of what makes Jordan great is he knows what he can get away with. Like, he knows the ref can't see it. He's been playing this game for 14 years. And if he doesn't know, he at least knows the odds that this is where I am on the court. That's where the referee is. I've done this a billion times. He probably can't see if I push off right here. And to be fair, like, there's a lot of guys that kind of did these little, like, dirty kind of moves. John Stockton is regarded by a lot of players as one of the dirtiest players ever in terms of, like, cheap fouls, just, like, little just shoves and pushes and stuff like that. And Jordan knew they are not going to call this. And that, to me, is part of being a brilliant basketball player. Like, if he pushes a little harder, then Russell falls down, they call the foul. He gives just the right amount of push. He's at just the right angle. I think it's an awesome moment. And I mean, obviously one of like the defining, shots, camera shots that you can remember from sports is that reverse kind of end zone angle of Jordan making the shot on Russell.
And for me, I think two things. One, if Russell doesn't kind of stumble, because I think actually he slips too. I actually think he gets actually crossed over. Nowadays, that's a big deal. He gets crossed over. Two things to me. One, I can't believe they didn't send another guy over to double. You got to get the ball out of his hands. That's unbelievable that the Jazz decided not to do that. I don't know if it was one of those they were afraid to get illegal defense or whatever. It's mind-numbing. I don't care how good Brian Russell was as a defender. There was no shot that Jordan was going to pass that ball. Though I know he did pass in the past, but if you're Michael Jordan, this is going to be your last game. Who's going to take that shot? Steve Kerr, John Paxson.
Who hasn't shot all game?
Yeah. What I'm saying is that he did that in the past, and people said, you always have the iconic Paxson, Kerr hits some big shot. I'm saying in this moment, Jordan knows he's going to, in retrospect, we know he's taking this shot. So first of all, you got to get the ball out of his hands. I don't care what you have to do. You got to get the ball out of his hands. Two, if Russell doesn't slip and fall, it won't look as bad. His push off is not as big of a push off as it really might look like it, because as he comes back, if you look at it, he comes back to take the jump shot. And is able to leave it up there. I love how he left it up there. I think that's a much more iconic than the shot against the Cavaliers that everybody talks about because he's whooping it up. That was all about him at that point. This was a winning, defining, perfect moment. The other thing is, Zach, I loved that his defense is what got them back to get the ball. Yep. And that's something that is under talked about with Jordan. He was one of the best defenders ever, not just in his era, ever. And he was able to come off his guy, go get that steal from Malone, who, by the way, has the ball where, Patrick? Down low, where you can get it, because why? You get tired and you bring the ball down. You say to all my big men all the time, keep the ball above your head, stupid. There's no reason for it to drop. And what happens there? He rips him, gets the steal. So in that under a minute, Jordan does it all. And I do think that the perfect pose, everything, I knew he was going to, quote unquote, retire right after that shot. Just the way his mannerisms were, just the way that whole thing went down. I didn't think there was a shot that Utah was going to be able to score again, but the possession that they had for that made Mark Turgeon look like Coach K coming out of the timeout.
Oh my God. For a guy that's regarded as one of like the great coaches of the past 40 years, Jerry Sloan, what are you doing? Like, you want to talk about like
5 seconds is an eternity in the NBA, especially when you get the ball at half court.
Keep it simple, stupid. Karl Malone's got 37 points. He's been just abusing the Bulls the entire game, even though he got stripped. And again, I do want to mention, like, actually, I remember from the first quarter, Jordan does the same thing. It's early in the first quarter. He strips Malone in a double, and I wonder if he had that kind of filed back in his head of just like, you know what? Maybe I don't do this every time, but at some point, again, he's going to keep that ball down low, and I'm going to rip him again.
But he looks so gassed in the third, and that's what everybody talks about, him going to this other level, right? I mean, he looks so tired, and they mentioned on the broadcast about how, we're going to see Jordan kind of ease up on defense a little bit and rest and focus, more on offense, and we see that in the third, but this is all about him playing both sides, right? I mean, it's a layup followed by a strip steal followed by a crossover and the game-winning shot in a minute, and it's just going to a level that nobody else is able to go to with the skill that he has, and that's really what defined his career, and that's why I think it's the perfect ending to the dynasty and to his career.
45 points in 44 minutes. That's pretty good.
Crazy. We got to talk about how this one ended. So Utah calls timeout at 5.2 seconds left. They draw up the play. You guys kind of hit on it. They draw up the play. Stockton takes the inbound pass. They planned.
Stockton, he took a terrible three.
He misses the game-winning three. It's ugly. 5.2 seconds, like you guys said, plenty of time to set something up, but very, very ugly finish. I mentioned early on in the pod about how they immediately replay Stockton missing this rather than Jordan winning it with his 20-footer, which I thought was kind of a downer. Tough finish for Utah. Amazing finish for Michael Jordan. Amazing way to wrap up the career. And yeah, I'm gonna ignore the Wizards years as well. This is the way I wanted it to finish. Just huge. You can't say enough about it. There's a 10-hour documentary series all about this moment. So what can we say in an hour-long podcast? But just truly incredible. And you look at the ratings for this game, and the whole world was captivated by it. 35.9 million viewers, a 22.3 Nielsen rating, 38 share. It was the highest rated and most watched game in the history of the NBA. And after Jordan retired, we kind of saw things change a little bit, Jab, in the NBA. So they had a lockout in 98-99, and it wasn't until the 2001 finals, Game 5, when the Lakers won their second consecutive championship under Phil Jackson, that the NBA topped the ratings of the 1998 Game 6. So things, the league was really dependent on Michael Jordan, and without him, kind of struggled there for a little while.
They definitely did, and I'm well aware of the 2000 and 2001, 2002 Lakers of that eras when Shaq got there and Kobe, with those two guys were at the height of their powers. And Phil Jackson and the whole cast of characters ended up going on their little run. But it was Jordan, and it really, really, really was just iconic at the end when he's going up with the six fingers and to the Utah. It's almost like he's really angry at the Jazz crowd too. You notice that? It's like he's got to let everybody know he's putting up the Jonathan Scope. He's just up there with the six, and he just keeps going with doing that. And then it's almost like the teammates kind of came to him, but the teammates almost rattled around themselves. That was a very singular moment for me too, Patrick, is that Jordan was kind of like a couple guys came and hugged him, but it was almost like he needed to get this out all by himself.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it must be weird because like he won them that game. Like, no, like Yeah, Tony Kukoc had 15 points. Yeah, Pippen provided a decent decoy, but it was the Michael Jordan show, for better or for worse. And at some points in the third quarter, it was for worse because he couldn't. He was missing his shots. But it was him versus the world. It was kind of like when the LeBron game against the Warriors, that game one where they lost because of J.R. Smith didn't know how much time was left. LeBron did everything. I mean, and the same thing in this vein. Jordan did everything in this game, absolutely everything to win this game. So I feel kind of weird. Like, what do you go over and say to Michael Jordan? Just like, good job, thanks for. I think there was a quote that he said to Bill Wennington in the last episode where he said, "Get on or grab the cape and hold on." I think that's what he said to Bill Wennington.
That's perfect. Well, that's Game 6 of the 1998 NBA Finals, fitting into the career of the best player in NBA history. So, Jab, where were you?
So I was, at that time, I was clearly living still in San Diego. I was living in Pacific Beach, a city of note. If you guys can ever get out there, it's now you guys are both kind of bunned up, so it's very tough, but it's a good spot. Let's just call it that way. Living as the kids would call it, your best life until you have your own kids. And it was just an amazing series going back and forth. And like I said, I was a Laker fan, so I hated the Jazz. Like for you guys you guys hated the Bulls. I understand Patrick's situation too, and I know Zach loved Jordan, but I mean, in general, you guys didn't have like a rooting, like anger. I mean, I really despise the Jazz a lot. And I'm so glad you brought it up, Patrick. John Stockton was the dirtiest player ever, but because he wore high shorts and because he was this, sweet looking guy that didn't look like he could hurt anybody, he set screens and would take his kneecap and put it right into your thigh every single time when they ran stuff. He was a dirty player, but I remember it like it was yesterday, Zach. This whole thing for me, the music in The Last Dance, just all of it is it really came at a great time, honestly. I'm so glad they moved this whole thing up to when they did, because during this time we're all in there and just trying to find stuff. It really gives you that 2 hours of bliss, for me at least, and to be able to watch it with Jackson, my son, and to a lesser extent my younger son Noah, and them to understand about Jordan. They know who he is, but to be able to see what he did and see how basketball was played is really, really great for me. It's really, really fun.
It's been amazing to relive it, and I want to echo what Jab is saying about The Last Dance, which has been incredible, and perfect timing for something like that. So it's a really true deep dive into it, and I have fun doing this podcast, but it's amazing having 10 hours of content really going into the whole career of Jordan, and learning a little bit more than we knew before, which is awesome. So
the footage is amazing that they have some of this footage too.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
The games that they played during the Space Jam, like being able to play in that area. And I know Reggie Miller went to UCLA, so there's guys there. But just the people that were Juwan Howard, Patrick, you just see these guys that, you watched and followed. It was just a fantastic thing. But this game defined what the basketball was like during that time. And honestly, Zach, I think basketball completely changed as soon as they came back from the lockout. It's almost like Jordan put the final vault on the Jordan, Bird, Magic era. And then I think when we transition into the 2000s, I think it kind of changes, because I think Kobe becomes more like Jordan later in his career. But that's kind of where you start seeing the three-point thing. Because if you notice, guys, in this game, both teams shot less three-pointers than any team that I can remember in a finals. I mean, the Bulls were 4 for 10, and the Jazz was 2 for 10. 10. Think about that. I think James Harden gets up 10 threes, Patrick, in like the first quarter.
Yeah, the 90s were an ugly time for basketball. Like if this didn't involve Michael Jordan and the greatest player of all time, man, this is some ugly basketball. Once it gets to the 2000s, it starts spreading out a little bit. Probably not until like 2010 or so does it really like the 3-point revolution really kick in. But yeah, who won the next couple finals? The Spurs, then your boys, then the Spurs again. So there was
fundamental.
Mr. Fun. Oh God, I love Tim Duncan. Yeah, it was an ugly time for basketball, but I mean, fortunately, they had the greatest player in the world to help out.
3 stars from this game. Number 1, Michael Jordan, 45 points, game winner. That's pretty easy. Number 2, I'm going to go with Karl Malone, who really, sadly, never got that championship, but was played really solid in this game and, faded at the end, but still had 31 points, 11 rebounds, and 7 assists. 3 was a tough one for me. I end up going with Tony Kukoc, who, I thought really stepped up in the absence of Scottie Pippen in most of this game. He's got 15 points. He, was helpful with assists, 4 assists.
Yep.
I don't know. I think you can make a case for Rodman for the job that he did against Malone, but those are my 3. What do you got, Jeb?
I actually had the exact same ones. Kukoc actually was really good, and he had 0 turnovers in the game. That's the other thing that stood out to me, too, is the turnover. There wasn't a lot of turnovers. The Bulls turned it over only 9 times in the game, in a game that was kind of defensive-oriented and kind of ugly at some points, like you guys pointed out. So I definitely had this exact same thing. I put Karl number 2 as well. I would actually give if you're going to give whatever the opposite of a star is, I think John Stockton had one of his worst games. And I think one of the reasons why, and Patrick pointed it out, I think one of the reasons why they did lose this game was because Stockton was so brutal.
I had 2 of the same, and I've kind of been debating this because I thought obviously the logical choice was Kukoc. I am going to go with Scottie Pippen. Scottie Pippen, he was only on the court for 25 minutes, so not obviously nearly as much as Jordan Kukoc, but Utah was still so afraid of him. There are moments in the third quarter where he can't move. There's a moment where I think it's either Jordan or Ron Harper's posting up. They give it to Pippen beyond the 3-point line, and he throws a half-ass fake at a shot. I mean, he can barely move. And Hornacek jumps. Hornacek really believes he's going to shoot it, and he just dishes it back inside for an easy layup for Harper. And if you look at it, Scottie Pippen, just looking at the plus minus in this game, the Bulls are plus 16 with Scottie Pippen on the floor. Yeah, he's obviously hurt. He can barely move. The fact that he was able to get out there and contribute, positively after the game before he had such a horrific game, just the presence of him made a huge difference in this game. So I would give him a star for just being out there and just by his presence making a huge difference in the outcome of this.
Yeah, and Stockton was fair. A minus 13, Zach, too, for his plus minus. You're going to do a minus 13 there, too. So that was huge, and he only had 5 assists. I mean, Stockton has 5 assists usually in the middle of the first quarter. So, and all the shots that Malone was getting, he was right off the wing there. So they were passing it to Horny, and Horny was they were playing just a 2-man game. So it's just an interesting thing, and I still think I still would love to have – I would like to do a Jerry Sloan documentary on that last timeout. I don't know. I think it's crazy to me, Patrick.
I want to know how Malone feels. I don't think he'll ever say anything to Stockton's his guy. They're inextricably. They're always going to be linked together. Stockton and Malone, greatest pick and roll combination ever. But I am very curious how Karl Malone feels that John Stockton contested 25-footer was his last good shot at a championship in his prime.
Yep. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough, man. But a amazing look back at Jordan's career, and I don't know, guys. Maybe the most fun I've had doing the pod so far. This was a good one. So it continues to get better and better, and I think we've got something pretty exciting in store for next week too, right, Chad?
Yeah, it's funny though, Zach, you talk about how much fun we had on this one. Well, we're not going to have as much fun with the next one, I don't think, because what we're going to do is give ourselves some pain. We're going to bring up and we're going to talk about the games, our worst loss as a fan, what games for us that meant a lot to us and something that you remember. I remember this, and this is all I will tease it with, Zach. After the game that I'm going to talk about next week, I went into my garage and I beat up everything in my garage that I could get my hands on. And my wife came outside and said, "Are you okay?" And you know how I am with Trisha. She is the boss. She runs, and I'm totally fine with it. I told her to turn around and keep moving because I was distraught. It's also the time where I realized, Patrick, that it's just sports and get a hold of yourself, big stupid.
Yeah. Oh, man. I definitely, there's so many to pick from, and I have so many different responses because there's a game that I can definitely think of where I had a response like that when I was in college.
Yep.
And then there's other games where I'm older, where I'm just like, you just get existential, and you're just like, why am I doing this?
Yes,
like,
yes, I know.
Why do I keep putting myself through this?
It's not worth it.
Do I want my children to watch sports? Like, this is terrible.
I know. There's a hole in the wall in my parents' old bedroom from one of these games. I don't know if that's going to be the one that I pick, but I've definitely had that crisis as well, Patrick, where I'm on the phone and talking to my dad and saying, why do we put ourselves through this? Is it really worth it? So we'll talk about, we'll each have our pick, and we'll run through those games. So that should be a good exercise for next week. But this was a fun look back at 1998 in the NBA Finals. So Jabby Burns, thanks so much for your insight. Thanks for being here. Good talking to you, my friend.
Love doing it. Thank you so much, guys. You guys have a fantastic week.
Patrick Guthrie, thanks for being here. Always good talking to you.
Thanks for having me, man. Hopefully next week I will be able to do this and not be in a delivery room. We're getting close, guys. We're getting
very close. I know. Very close. So we're anxiously awaiting that text message from you. So thank you for listening to the Retro Sports Rewind. If you like this week's show, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to pods. Also, please rate and review the show. Our intro music is Proto Funk by Kevin MacLeod. Mid-show stinger is Scarlet Fire by Otis McDonald. And outro music is District 4 by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you so much for listening to this week's show. We will see you next week as we torture ourselves through our 3 worst games that we've ever endured as fans. Take care. See you next week.